hopefully you can all see that okay. And I'm also going to try and open the chat so I can still see it. There we go. Great. So plant blindness, as you've very correctly said, is a low awareness or interest about plants compared to animals. And it was first defined the term plant blindness was kind of created, as it were, in the late 1990s, and then the term plant awareness was developed just very recently, just a couple of years ago, as a more kind of contemporary term. And there's been over 100 academic studies about plant blindness, plant awareness since the late 1990s. And this lack of appreciation about plants drives an anti-plant bias in both education and conservation and research, and has also led to a green skills gap in industry. This extinction of botanical education was the subject of a paper published by Seb and his co-authors last year. So there's details of that in the slide. And it's important to highlight that this deficit in awareness extends to some other taxonomic groups. So my latest research is looking at how this lack of attention extends to invertebrates, because it's very much about being drawn to mammals and birds and not so interested in everything else. So what causes plant blindness? So in our review study last year, which is provided there, we found that plants blindness has only emerged in the most urbanized societies. It's not found in social groups where there's regular interactions with plants, such as in traditional resource dependent societies. And this suggests that it's not necessarily something we're born with, but arises from a more general disconnection from nature in urban society. And what I'd be interested to find out now is in the chat is what kind of misconceptions about plants have you come across, either in your students or just more broadly? So misconceptions about plants, what kind of things have you heard students or other people say that's kind of a bit misguided on plants? They don't respire. Yes, so that's a classic one, is that they produce oxygen but don't produce carbon dioxide. Younger students don't realize plants are living. That's right. And quite frighteningly, some adults don't realize plants are living either. So not just children. Yes, they don't move. That's a common one that sadly doesn't just happen at primary. It also persists to secondary. Brilliant. And what the research has found, they do wee-wees. Oh, that's an interesting one. Taller plants use more carbon as they're nearer the sky. Well, there's some fascinating ones here. Yeah, plants have little connection with everyday lives, which is quite unnerving when you think how frequently you are dependent on a plant in day-to-day life. Concept of weeds. So yes, plants in the wrong place, unwanted plants, plants only being desirable if you've planted them and controlled them. Flowering plants are the only plants that have a flower. So yes, that's grasses are very commonly thought not to be flowering plants. Surprised by plant diseases, surprised that plants have diseases. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't come across that, but I can imagine that actually. And I suppose the signs of plant stress and disease are very different to in animals, so that's probably surprising too. Plants don't reproduce. Yes, that's an interesting one, and a bit worrying that misconception could even exist. So quite an impressive collection there. More than one type of dandelion. Plants don't need feeding. No knowledge that plants produce drugs we use. Yes, that's interesting. So that's again that idea that plants aren't important, or that we're not entirely dependent on plants in multiple ways. Brilliant. So yeah, a list that just keeps expanding, and this is exactly what the literature showed as well, was misconceptions about a lack of movement, and also misconceptions about photosynthesis were very common, and about nutrition and reproduction. So at all levels, there's a lot of misunderstandings about how plants feed and what plant nutrition is. And also something that's covered a lot in the literature is poor identification skills, which again is something that's found at all ages. Some studies also found evidence of a bias to animals in textbooks or school science curricula. And about 40 studies to date have explored teaching and learning for plants at secondary science level, half of which are about plant identification. So that's particularly in countries that have more extensive coverage of ecology and taxonomy in their science curricula. So it'd be really great now to find out which age group or level you teach at, because we're going to take a look at the curriculum and the specs. So if you could just drop in the chat, you're teaching at 11 to 14, 14 to 16, post 16, or perhaps you're teaching across all levels in a more informal learning or CPD role. Great. So we've got a couple of post 16s so far in IT, and yeah, IT and teaching across all ages, outreach, engagement, food farming and environment. And that's something we'll be talking about as well as plants in agriculture, real world applications. Key stage 3, key stage 4, year 6 to 8, brilliant. So so quite a range. That's really nice. And this is just a summary that I've attempted to do of where plants appear in the curriculum. Although of course plants can fit into every part of the science curriculum. And there's a very nice document that Chris Graham has produced at Science and Plants for Schools, showing how you can bring plant examples into literally every part of the secondary curriculum. So that's worth checking out on their website. So there's 5 big ideas, as you probably know, that extend across the biology curriculum, all of which involve plants. We've got the cellular basis of life, which includes photosynthesis, inheritance and life cycles. Sorry, it includes photosynthesis. Then we've got inheritance and life cycles, organisms and their environment, variation, adaptation and evolution, and health and disease. And of course, the main opportunity for fieldwork is when we're looking at topics to do with organisms and their environment, but there's other opportunities elsewhere as well. So how many people have come across Science and Plants for Schools and have used their resources? And if you have, which resources have you used? That'd be an interesting thing to find out. So Science and Plants for Schools is a project funded by the Gatsby Foundation, which has a huge range of resources for plant sciences, from animations to instructions for practicals, particularly focused on practicals that are very reliable and give you good results, and lots of other resources for secondary and post 16. The bramble rust topic, yes, I like that one. That's a really nice one, isn't it? Looking at bramble rust under the microscope, investigating temperature relief, algal balls. Yes, I always think the algal balls are so pretty. They're really amazing and are just a really useful resource in science. Labeled all the wildflowers in our friendship garden. Oh, lovely. That sounds amazing. Brilliant. So that's something I'm going to be talking about, is that kind of giving identity to plants. brilliant biology Olympiad training, algal balls, photosynthesis and germination. Great, so that's brilliant to hear that you're familiar with SAPS already and already using those resources. And the approaches that I'm going to be talking about are kind of designed to build on SAPS and work in conjunction with what's already out there. So the first topic I'm going to cover is the use of plant collections, whether inside or out. But I'm going to talk particularly about plant collections that you can bring into the classroom. So having a selection of common wild plants in pots. And this is a resource that I've used a lot in science teaching, and they're really handy as quick examples when you cover topics like adaptations to environment, life cycles, taxonomy, ecological succession. So it's a great way of just kind of reminding people about, reminding learners about the amazing diversity in plants and having kind of real life examples that you can kind of hold up and show and do a kind of 5-minute inquiry with in the class. It's a great way of getting learners to start noticing and recognizing the plants that are in their local environments, some of which they'll be walking past every day, but never noticed before or even kind of really know that they're there. And of course, a great precursor to fieldwork and student-led investigations, because something that's really valuable with fieldwork is to have priming activities, so that when students get out to the field, they're not kind of distracted or disorientated. They kind of have some prior experience that helps them to tune into that change in environment. Obviously, if you've got very extensive school grounds and can kind of pop out every time you want to look at some examples of plants, this isn't so necessary. But if you have more limited opportunities on site, then this can be really great. You're basically digging up the kind of species that appear on a playing field or back garden, putting them into small pots. It's illegal to dig up plants from the wild without permission, but if you don't have a good selection at home or school, it's usually pretty easy to get permission. The kind of organisations I've used before have been an allotment association that had lots of nice plants in allotments, but also around the edges, like the hedgerows, for example, and also gardens open to the public. So we've got a garden near here that was next to a college I used to teach at, and I would regularly go and dig up plants, because of course a lot of these are just considered weeds to somebody managing a garden, so they're only too happy for you to come and dig them up. Best to go for smaller species that don't outgrow a small pot, and I'm going to show you some suggestions of species in a moment. It takes a while to build up a good collection, but then you can keep them going for about a year before they get too big or tatty. And then what's quite nice with the perennials is actually to plant them out in the wildlife garden if you've got one in the school, as a way of kind of developing that and introducing some new species. I usually keep them in a cold frame, which is kind of mini greenhouse, and I keep them in trays so they're easy to move from the cold frame to the classroom and easier to water. And it's best to pot them up in a garden potting compost rather than the soil that they come up in, because that way they're a bit lighter to carry and easier to water. And if you go for something like a leaf mold, it's also low nutrients, so it stops them getting too big. You can also buy seed for most of the species I'll be talking about, and there's some web links for purchasing seeds, usually about £1 a packet, so not too extortionate. So these are the first species I'm going to share with you. So we've got from left to right, wood avens, dead nettles, ground ivy, and herb Roberts. These are all quite common in hedgerows, edges of fields. You might have them around edges of your playing field. And these are all adapted for life in the shade. And wood avens does eventually get too big and outgrow the pot, but the others all stay fairly small. And these species tend to have leaves that are dark green with a large area to volume ratio, of course, to capture sufficient light for photosynthesis. Brilliant. That's really nice, Sarah. I'm glad you like the idea. So you'll notice I've put some funny little symbols on here. The nose symbol means the plant has a distinctive smell when you rub it, which is usually a defense against insect herbivory. So already the way you're experiencing these plants is starting to reveal some of the adaptations to environment. You can see that well, I don't know if you can see actually, depends how big your screen is. This dead nettle is slightly hairy, which is probably also a defense against insect herbivory. And you'll see some of these have a tongue symbol on, which means they're edible. So that can be another fun thing to bring into teaching. And in fact, many of these plants were wild food sources in Europe for centuries, particularly in times of famine, and a kind of experiencing a comeback with the kind of wild plant foraging movement. And the interesting thing about the dead nettles, so you've got white dead nettle and red dead nettle, which look very similar, is if you, except white dead nettle's bigger, if you move them to a sunny location, the leaves will take on a reddish or pinkish tinge. So that's really nice. And it's due to the production of anthocyanins. There's a few reasons why plants produce anthocyanins. It might be to protect leaves from excessive sunlight or to reduce herbivory again, or could be a combination of factors. And this is an example of phenotypic plasticity, which is really nice to bring in when you talk about evolution and phenotypes and genotypes, and is actually a really good way of increasing appreciation of plants as well, because this is plant behavior. Increasingly, scientists are calling this plasticity, which is the ability of individual genotypes to produce different phenotypes when exposed to different environmental conditions. And increasingly, this is being described as plant behavior. And that's exactly what the dead nettles are doing, is when they're in the shade, they're looking quite dark green, but then if you move them to the sun, they will start to develop a reddish tint to the leaves. So it's plasticity, it's kind of plastic adaptation to different environmental conditions. And you'll see this with a lot of these species, and a classic one is to measure the leaf size, the leaf length of nettles that are growing in the shade and comparing it to nettles that are growing in the light. So you can see that how that area to volume ratio of leaves varies with location. So another example of phenotypic plasticity is in the ground ivy, which is one of those 4 species there. And ground ivy produces stolons for vegetative reproduction. And the length between plantlets, so you can see in the photograph, you've got the stem, the stolon, and then the new clones or plantlets along it. And the internodal length, the length between the plantlets, will be greater if the plant is in shade. And that's, of course, allowing the plant to reach the light with less investment in tissue resources to get there. So it will vary that internodal length depending on its environment. And if the stolons root into nutrient-rich soil, they'll start rapidly branching in all directions, whereas in poor soil, they will branch less. So again, adapting their behavior according to environment. And this would make a fascinating growth experiment, I reckon, probably putting the ground ivy in seed trays instead of pots, so that the clones have the freedom to kind of root and exhibit that plasticity. These species are tolerant of seasonal waterlogging. So we've got creeping buttercup, white clover, and annual meadowgrass. So if you left them standing in a tray of water, neglected, unlike other plants that will start to look pretty unhappy, they will probably carry on growing. And I've really neglected some of these potted plants. And I have to say, these always look pretty happy, whatever the however much water they're sitting in. And this is another plastic response going on here called programmed cell death. So this is creeping buttercup. You can see along this seasonal stream that's just in a field around the corner from me. And when it's submerged like this, the cells in the cortex, in the root tissue, will die back to form aerenchyma, that kind of spongy, air-filled tissue that is particularly common in rushes, soft rush, for example. That's what's shown there is a cross-section of soft rush. And creeping buttercup can also maintain low levels of photosynthesis when it's submerged, producing oxygen for respiration to keep the plant going until the water levels die down. So a very humble plant, creeping buttercup, that you very likely to have on your playing field, but actually has some really fascinating adaptations. And if you have a field that gets playing field that gets waterlogged, then that's a nice thing to talk about. So we also had a white clover there in that suite of plants. And of course, this is a legume, so an opportunity to also bring in nitrogen fixation. And if you remove the white clover from the pot, you should be able to see its root nodules. But again, the plant will behave plastically. So if it's grown in nutrient-rich soil, it tends to produce no root nodules or very few nodules. Because there's no benefit in investing in them in a nutrient-rich environment. But if it's in a poor soil, then you'll get a nice selection of nodules like here. And you can see that these ones in the middle have a pinkish color, which is a production of pigment called leg hemoglobin, and shows that the nodule is active. So a nice investigation is to grow the clover or any other nitrogen fixing legume in leaf mold, and then compare it to one grown in a fertilized compost, and compare what happens with the root nodules. Yes, it's really interesting when you pot up the minute you pot up plants, even quite common weeds, it's almost like framing a picture. It kind of just increases appreciation, just the fact they're in pots. There's something about something being in pots that almost gives us permission to kind of appreciate it and find it interesting. Whereas if it's popping up in a flower bed, then now immediate reaction is just, oh my God, that's boring, and in the wrong place, and I need to pull it up. So just the fact these are in pots, I found has been incredibly educationally rewarding. Try to include some different divisions, plant divisions as well in your collection for when you cover classification. And I find that wall ferns can be particularly nice as a small fern that lives happily in a small pot. And wall ferns only grow perfectly well in soil. And then we've got a moss here, and then a liverwort. This is a liverwort called dripwort, which is very, very common in kind of dark, dank places. And of course, liverworts are in the same division as mosses. They're both bryophytes. So a really nice one there. And I just think dripwort is such an odd looking plant. It kind of immediately attracts attention. So next we have a suite of species that are pioneer species in ecological succession and rapidly colonize disturbed grounds, such as a freshly weeded flower bed. So here we have shepherd's purse, again going from left to right. I'm sure some of these will be familiar by sight, if not by name. Shepherd's purse, groundsel, hairy bittercress, very similar to wavy bittercress, chickweed, and pineapple weed, which is a very good one in pavement cracks. In fact, most of these will quite happily grow in a pavement crack. And they have incredibly short life cycles, which any gardener, the gardeners amongst you, will sympathise with the fact that pretty much as soon as you've weeded them up, the seedlings for the next generation are already popping up. So flowering within a few weeks, which means you can be bringing these into the classroom and just a few weeks later observing flower and seed production. And the other adaptation that's very characteristic of pioneer species is that they're self-pollinated, because they're often colonized in environments where insect pollinators haven't got to yet. So these will produce seeds quite readily in undercover environments. They also flower all year round pretty much. So even at the moment, I've certainly seen groundsel, pineapple weed, hairy bittercress in flower in my garden and close by. And then here are just some photographs of their different life cycle stages. And you can see groundsel has a very similar seed head to dandelion. It's like a miniature dandelion clock. Whereas hairy bittercress has these long pods, very typical of the Brassicaceae. And these seed pots will shatter and the seeds can be catapulted up to 2 meters away. So quite impressive for what is a very small plant. Shepherd's purse has an even more impressive adaptation for life in poor soil, which is that these heart-shaped seeds show a kind of primitive carnivory. So the seeds have a mucilaginous coating that attracts nematodes from the soil water. And then this, they will actually be kind of externally digested in effect in the mucilage. And the resultant nutrients are shown to result in better germination and growth rates in the plant. So can quite accurately be described as a kind of carnivory. So that's really fascinating, because students will often be aware of plants like Venus flytrap, but to then discover that a plant that just grows in pavement cracks is also kind of carnivorous, and that it's the seeds, which lots of students won't even think are alive, are doing the carnivory, is a real kind of learning moment for people. So what's also nice about the suites of plants I've shown you so far is that they exhibit a variety of seed dispersal methods. So those different common methods of seed dispersal are found in this selection. So from wind dispersal to self-dispersal to animal dispersal. And the animal dispersal one is quite surprising, because this isn't foxes and badgers and other furry animals that we normally think of as being seed dispersers. For red dead nettle, it's actually ants that are doing the dispersing, and this is because the seed has a fatty structure to one side called an elaiosome, and that's something you can see quite easily under a light microscope. Ants will carry these seeds to the nest to feed the elaiosome to develop in larvae, and the seed coat is too hard for an ant to crack, so it will just be left to germinate. And this is something that you find in ground ivy as well. So that was one of the plants I showed you at the beginning. And you also find it in a number of violet species. So common dog violet, for example, I believe has this mechanism. And then just finally, these are species to avoid because they can cause skin irritation or rashes. So before we move on to the next subject, does anybody have anything else to add about plant collections, or is this something anybody's ever done in class, potting up weeds and observing them? Or are there any weeds, wildflowers that you use in lab practicals, perhaps? Brilliant. So it sounds like this is a new idea for some, and one that you quite like the idea of, and we'll be experimenting with it. For we know, every secondary school teacher will have a collection of weeds, potted weeds in the classroom. Cocksfoot grass, yes, that's a really nice one for chromatography, isn't it? Very reliable. It's got a lovely dark green extract. Brilliant. So Sarah takes part in the BSBI wildflower hunts. Those are really great. There's a really fun one over New Year called the New Year Plants Hunt, where you look for plants in flower at New Year. And it's surprising how many plants there are in flower at that time of year, or at least down here where the weather's quite mild. Great. So the next subject we're going to be looking at is plant identification. And what would be really great to find out now is what kind of resources have you used to help you identify wild plants? So for example, have you used the Field Studies Council fold-out guides? Perhaps you've used identification guides, books, in other words, perhaps use an auto recognition app, or some sort of biological recording forum like iNaturalist, or social media. And also, do you use a hand lens? Have you used a hand lens before? Local botany expert. Oh, that's always nice to have. iNaturalist, yeah. An antique field seed collection in your potting sheds. That sounds amazing, Sarah. Opal resources. Oh, that's great to see somebody mention the Opal resources, because I worked for Opal as one of the community scientists, and I still use the resources a lot, but as the years go by, less and less people have heard of them, and they're still excellent resources. I still think there's been nothing that quite does what that set of resources did since then. Yeah, Woodland Trust website is absolutely brilliant, isn't it, for just really good imagery and good ID resources. I really like that one too. Brilliant. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about Seek and other auto recognition apps, wildlife trusts. Yeah, so a lot of wildlife trusts have really excellent resources on their website for ID. Brilliant. So again, lots of people familiar with Field Studies Council. Oh yes, thanks for reminding us about the Countryside Classroom, because that's a really great website for resources. And yes, learning outside the classroom, there's just a massive number of schemes of works, lesson plans on that website. Brilliant. So it sounds like most of you are familiar with the Field Studies Council resources. So this is a collection of, goodness, at least 50, maybe more like 100, well over 100 fold-out guides. They're laminated fold-out guides that are kind of robust and designed for the field environment, and have a kind of bite-sized suite of species, as it were. So really nice for working with students, not as daunting as a full guide. And sorry, just letting people in. Hopefully I did that correctly. And yeah, they're about £3.50 each, so a bit pricier to purchase a class set, but a very good investment. And I'll be talking about particular fold-out guides that I consider particularly valuable for working with students. The Botanical Society of the British Isles has a lot of advice about different ID resources. So if you're thinking of purchasing a new guide, or want to kind of find out what's available, that's worth checking out. Yes, the Playground Plants FSE guide, I would say if you're going to purchase one guide, that's the one to have. That's a kind of must-have for secondary schools. There's also a nice computer-based ID key for trees on the SAP's website, and that can be used in summer or winter. So it's based on leafy twigs as well as leafless twigs, so can be used all year round. And then we have the auto recognition apps, where you point your phone at a plant and the app will try and identify it. So there was a study that BSBI were involved in, that tested the different apps and looked at accuracy rates, and they found that Seek had the lowest error rate. So even though it wasn't the app that was most likely to identify a plant to species level, it was the one that was least likely to get it wrong. So that's the one I would recommend going for that reason alone. And Google Lens, Flora Incognita and PlantNet also performed perfectly well, so they're all fine too, whereas the rest of the apps on the markets were found to have quite poor accuracy, so best to avoid those others. The other nice thing about Seek is it doesn't require internet access to operate, whereas all the others do. And of course, it's embedded in iNaturalist. So it's encouraging students to start using a biological recording scheme. And this study here investigated the kind of pedagogic opportunities for iNaturalist and found it a really great way of engaging learners in plant biodiversity and starting to become citizen scientists. So that's a really great reason for using Seek as well. And it's important to bear in mind that even the best apps can only identify a plant to species level about 40% of the time. So it's still a good idea to have a backup resource alongside it. So if you're going to buy one field guide and you're a complete beginner, I really recommend the Collins Gems, because they have a very manageable number of species. There's one for trees, one for wildflowers, which cover about 180 species. And so it's feasible to be just flicking through and matching specimens to pictures if you're feeling daunted by the identification keys. And whereas some of the books, so this is one that I've always used a lot, the Wildflower Key. It's a lovely book, but the key, I've shown an excerpt of the key at the bottom there, and you can see it's very reliant on botanical terminology, and this can be very off-putting for beginners. So this is not one I tend to use with beginners, even at undergraduate level. This is one that I'd introduce learners to gently, especially as progressively students' ID skills are getting worse and worse. And another approach that we use is encouraging students to come up with their own descriptive terms for morphological features as a kind of soft way into interacting with the botanical terminology. And this was an approach that we evaluated in one of our studies and found really effective for engagement. So even though it's not, it's obviously not increasing students' botanical technical skills in terms of the correct terminology. It was very engaging, so it didn't kind of frighten the undergraduate students we're working with completely off botany. And you can even do the same with plant names, because as long as you can recognize the plant, the same plant again, you can still accurately collect data for diversity indices. And that's something that's particularly good to resort to if you're working in a very species-rich habitat, where it's realistically going to take all day for students to collect data. Kind of just doing ID for some of the species can be a way of speeding things up a bit. And that's a great idea, Seb, running a practical with a terminology booklet, giving them cuttings to grow afterwards. So this is an approach that I've used a lot with post-16 students when we've been doing quite complex grassland surveys, is just literally taping specimens in a tray with the names next to the plants, for them to use as they're doing their survey. And obviously it's not advancing their understanding of an identification key, but it is promoting recognition. So they're going to end up being able to confidently ID a larger number of specimens, and they're not having to wade through a key for every specimen. Brilliant. So that's all I'm going to say on the ID for the moment. Is there anything anybody would want, anything you'd like to add about plant ID, or any questions or comments before we move on? And just to say, if you've got complete beginners, this is a nice one, the tree name trail, and there's a couple of other titles in that name trail series that were designed for primary learners, but are actually used a lot at secondary level as well. Great. So so looking at fieldwork, so we do the same thing about terms, but students still want to use the right term. Yeah, and that's really great. That's exactly what you want to be working towards, is after that initial introductory session, actually starting to get to grips with the terminology, and that really helps later on and improves your confidence with ID keys. So thinking now about field work, so what I'd like to ask you to consider next is what makes a vegetation survey engaging and productive for students? What are the kind of must-haves for any sorts of field work, survey and vegetation, for it to be engaging and productive? The plants need to be there. Yes, spot on. That's exactly what I'm going to be focusing on. Is you need data, don't you? You need the satisfaction of actually getting some data and being able to see the plants, and needing to be able to recognize them. Yeah, flowers make it more interesting, as they're easier to spot than grasses, encourage insects. Clipboards, yeah, so there's a certain requisites of equipment that really helps here, and there's nothing more frustrating than the students scribbling on scrappy bits of paper that you know are going to get lost with a kind of whole day's data on. So clipboards are a great way of avoiding that. Although I find that even if you give all students clipboards, some of them still resort to the scrappy bits of paper. Cameras, yeah, that's a great way of capturing particularly a species for then retrieval later. Yeah, that's always nice. If the weather's good, it makes all the difference, doesn't it? And is one of the most frustrating things I always think about organising fieldwork in this country, is the complete unpredictability of weather. Brilliant. So so this is the play and field plants fold out guide that came up earlier. And as I say, is the kind of most indispensable. It has an identification guide to the 30 most common playing field plants on one side, and then on the other side it has a section about their adaptations and tips for planning investigations. If you have less managed grassland, however, then this Grassland Plants 1 fold out guide is also useful. That's the guide to neutral grassland. It's unlikely that you'd be working on limestone grasslands, but if you do, then Grassland Plants 2 is the one to go for. Yeah, so Aaron shows the students pictures of plants they'll see before they go out, and that's really crucial, I think, with field work, is that priming activity that starts to get learners tuned into what they're going to see, and means that once they're out into the distracting outdoor environment, they've got a framework for what they're going to be doing. Oh, Paul John's playing field is AstroTurf. Yes, that's my son's school has a AstroTurf playing field, and that's we sympathise. That is very depressing, isn't it? That's why you need the potted plants, you see, so that if you have AstroTurf, then you can resort to a cold frame full of potted plants instead. Brilliant. So the great thing about grassland surveys, so that's what I'm going to talk about, is specifically doing grassland surveys. It sounds like John has to go out elsewhere than the school campus for that. And the great thing is you can do them almost all year round. So a lot of the plants have distinctive morphological features in terms of their leaf shapes, etc., and are fairly straightforward to ID and get data for, even in the middle of winter, as long as the grass hasn't just been mown. That's always the hazard, I think, with grassland surveys, is you don't always know when it's going to get mown. Quadrats on the concrete playing ground and count bits of chewing gum rather than plants. I've come across that quite a number of times. And I worked for the Field Studies Council. We had all sorts of imaginative stuff happening on playgrounds with bottle tops and all sorts for students to do their quadrat field work. An interesting one actually is to look at lichens, because even on concrete, lichens will often be present. So you may have some real living organisms. Can be a bit hard to tell apart from the chewing gum, though, some lichens. Can they detect the brand? Brilliant. A scrubby verge next to the Astro. Yes, that's exactly what yeah, the same at my son's school. That's what they do there. Brilliant. So the first thing to do is to look at your playing field or other vegetated environment, hopefully vegetated, and think about the opportunities, because the field work will be much more satisfying if the students are picking up tangible differences in species distributions according to environmental factors. There's nothing more empowering than field work that works and gives you some interesting results. So the first thing to do, as I'm sure you've all done, is just to get outside and look at what you've got and what opportunities you've got for interesting field work. So this football pitch, not great for playing football on, but absolutely brilliant for doing a survey, because you've got some obvious signs of compaction around the goalpost. So of course, if you run a transect from the goalposts out to the field border over there, then you're sampling on an environmental gradient, and you're probably going to capture some interesting data. That's amazing, Aaron, that you get bee orchids and pyramidal orchids on your staff car park verge. Very jealous. That's a really nice opportunity to have. Yeah, so more wildflowers around the paths and playground, less competition than with established plants in the garden. And what you'll most likely get is, as though many of you will know, is lots of greater plantain on the trampled areas, and then much higher diversity towards the hedge. And this is, as you know, probably is called systematic sampling. You're placing the quadrat at regular intervals along a tape measure or string to take your sample. And you will generally get a good result with pitfall traps for ground invertebrates in this sort of situation as well, because they're very sensitive to disturbance. And to measure compaction, the simplest but not most reliable method is pushing a knitting needle into the ground until you feel resistance. But some schools will hopefully have a penetrometer, which is the more standard way of measuring that. And using quadrats in this way can also be described as a belt transect, so that will tick another box on the spec. And if you require numerical data for a diversity index calculation, Simpsons, then the best option is try and count the number of individuals rooted inside the quadrat for each forb species. So forbs are all the flowering plants apart from the grasses, because obviously trying to sample grasses quantitatively is very difficult. And even with the forbs, because most of them are reproducing vegetatively, it can still be quite hard separating one individual from another in that situation. If you're lucky enough to have a tree with a dense canopy in open grassland, then you can capture a gradient of light intensity and leaf litter depth. So that's another one that gives you really nice data. And you can either use a light meter or a simple canopy measure scale like this one, or even use both and compare, which is also interesting to investigate the limitations of light meters. So obviously, if you've got a playing field similar to this rugby pitch, there's less obvious variation across the field, and you're not going to get, the students aren't going to get such interesting data. Here we have a path, a very typical situation where you've got some sort of desire line going across the grassland. And some students might say, okay, let's run a transect from the path towards these less managed areas out towards the edges. But you can see there's actually not much sign of impact away from the path. People are walking along the path, but not out from it. So you're not really picking up a gradient in the same way as those other examples. But what you probably do have are areas of grass that are mown every few weeks for the actual pitch area, and then other areas that are just mown occasionally. And this provides an opportunity for what's called stratified sampling. And what you would need to do here is first partition the grassland community into sub-communities like this, and then work out a sampling strategy for each area. And the most common one that I certainly use here is random sampling, where you place two 30-meter tape measures, like the axes of a graph, generate random numbers, and then plot XY coordinates like this. And if you get coordinates that fall outside the sampling area, then you just reject them and take the next ones. So who has done a grassland survey similar to that? Is that what most people are doing when they do grassland surveys, or do you have some other approaches that you're using as well? And if you've got any other questions about grassland surveys before we move on, then just drop them into the chat. Brilliant. So that's the standard method. Toss quadrats over your head. Yeah. That's always an interesting one. It's very frowned upon in field work, the throw in the quadrat, because of course you then don't have every spot, every point having an equal probability of being sampled, so you shouldn't be able to use that data for statistical analysis. But interestingly, I worked for a grassland project, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute, which is very good quality research. It was linked to Rothamsted research, but surprisingly, that method of just throwing the quadrat over your shoulder is used even in kind of applied research. So you'd be surprised how that one does pop up. Brilliant. So what I'd like to consider next is the kind of real world applications of these type of surveys, because this is what makes them more interesting. And these kind of vegetation surveys are used in ecological research and agronomy. So really valuable for to kind of share that with students, that, you know, this is real research that they're doing, and these are techniques that are used in industry. And we're producing a video about agricultural grassland management in our next open access course. And the project I used to work for was called the Toolbox of Multi-Species Swards, which was a project between Rothamsted Research and Duchy Rural Business School. And these multi-species swards, which are also called herbal lays, I don't know how many people have heard of them, they're very popular at the moment. They're being adopted by lots of farmers because they're highly productive, but have less negative environmental impacts than conventional pastures. And there's a picture of one in that slide. So it's got all sorts of kind of interesting herb species like chicory, and various interesting legumes and ribwort plantain, and has a number of benefits for livestock health as well as the environment. So that's quite an interesting one to bring in, and there's the web link there. And we produced this mobile apps for farmers to design their own herbal lays. And we also used it with post-16 college students. So what you need is some sort of real or imagined farm scenario about the environmental challenges and aims of the farm. And then students use this app to kind of design an ideal herbal lay for the farm in question. And you can see there you've got kind of different functional traits and a kind of traffic light system about how well that species performs for that characteristic. And then alongside any discussion about agricultural grassland is also the need to reduce livestock production and its substantial carbon and land footprint. And if that's something you're interested in, then that was partly what we covered in our last MOOC called Future Food, and you can that's free to access, by the way. So there's videos and all sorts of resources in that MOOC about those issues. Another big ecological challenge in the UK is the problem of nutrient enrichment. And students will often have come across eutrophication, but won't know that nutrient enrichment is also a big problem in terrestrial systems. It's caused by nitrogen oxides from vehicle exhausts, also ammonia gas and nitrates from agriculture, and has really negative impacts on plant diversity. And what we've seen is a steady decline in species diversity in the British flora over the years, and Plant Life have a lot of information about this on their website. And if you know of a lowland heath or a species-rich grassland, either next to a road or next to a big car park, this can make a really nice field trip for vegetation studies in transects, where you'll find that you get poor diversity and often signs of environmental stress in the plants near the road or the car park. And then as you move into the centre of the reserve, then you'll start to get higher diversity. Yeah, so SEB has done something similar to that as well. And I've put a couple of open access academic studies about that there as well, and is a nice one that we did a lot with undergraduate students. And the car park is an interesting one because not only do you have the pollution from the cars, but you also have lots of dog walkers, so definitely make sure you wear gloves for this one. And so you get a kind of a localized nutrient enrichment effect, and that's more to do with phosphorus pollution, where you get a lot of enrichment around the car park, because these poor dogs that are desperate to go to the toilet do their business, and then less of a problem as you get further away from the car park. So quite kind of fascinating study of various human impacts. Another great survey about nitrogen pollution, which doesn't need you to go quite so far away, is the Opal Air Survey, which uses lichens on trees as indicators of nitrogen pollution. And this is one that we did in lots of school grounds when the Opal project was running. And there's also some really nice maps and data sets from the National Survey to use in your investigations. And they had a really nice result, actually, where they were finding the lichen diversity was much lower for these bioindicator species in both rural and urban areas with high nitrogen pollution, and lower where pollution wasn't so great. So this is a really nice one to do, and it's based on a suite of 9 species that are relatively easy to identify, and you can download the survey instructions and the identification guide on those links. Another interesting survey to look at is the plasticity of grassland forbs with management. So remember, that's flowering plants apart from grasses. Many grassland forbs are rosette shaped to withstand trampling and protect the growing tip deep inside the plant from cutting and grazing. In long vegetation, of course, the adaptation is not so beneficial because of the shade. So the forb will grow in a more upright shape. And if you try this on the playing field, for example, with one square that you cut regularly, just with scissors, and one you don't, you should see a difference in your data for plant height and leaf angle. Indicator species were dropped in the last curriculum change. Yes, that was an incredible shame. That was when Opal was running, was the last curriculum, and it just made a really nice link, and a real shame it's gone, especially as it's more topical than ever with our current environmental challenges. And then completely unrelated, there's a nice video there about latex from dandelion. So the white stuff that oozes out is used in commercial rubber production, which I always just think is an absolutely fascinating little fact to share. So there's a video there about that application. And was particularly important for Russia in the Second World War, when rubber was they were very short of rubber from other sources. So I'm going to talk now about tree health surveys. So it'd be really interesting to know if you've ever done a tree health survey with students. Which one have you done, Sarah? So this is another great idea for real world field work that ties in with the curriculum and specs in multiple ways, because many of the GCSE A-level specs have communicable and non-communicable diseases. as a required area to cover. So this is an opportunity to explore those concepts. And in recent years, with climate change, the number of pests and diseases attacking trees has rocketed. So it's also very topical in terms of climate change and climate change adaptation. And Sarah's compared the health of indulged trees in our gardens versus those in our wildlife garden, which are less healthy. Oh, that's interesting. So you're looking kind of specifically at management and how that's affecting tree health. So that's really interesting. So these resources are from the Opal Tree Health Survey, which again, really great survey, very nice instructions there, and a very nice identification guide for trees and tree diseases there too. And then you submit the data to a Tree Alert, which you can download as an app. And that's another real citizen science survey where the data will actually get used in scientific research. So a kind of authentic survey, unlike some citizen science surveys. And the pests and diseases that you're most likely to see in your local area, if it's anything like what we've got down here in Plymouth and Exeter and surrounding areas, is a downy mildew on oak. This is a really common one for us because the southwest is so wet and damp. The horse chestnut leaf miner, tar spot on sycamore, which I know is more common in some areas than others. And then, of course, sadly, ash dieback, which is very common, increasingly common everywhere. And the easiest survey to link in with biotic or abiotic factors, so covering another topic on the curriculum, is tar spot in sycamore. And that's because it's more common in areas with low air pollution, so away from busy roads, and less common on trees where there's leaf litter removal, for example, street trees. So a number of interesting factors there to use in experimental design. And we're producing some videos with instructions on doing those surveys in our forthcoming MOOC. So in fact, we're covering all those 4 species. So that's something to watch out for. Any other questions or comments about tree surveys, tree health before we move on? The 4th tree disease was ash dieback. And that's the most common sign of that. Sorry, that picture's not very good. Is the areas of brown withered leaves in the leaf crown, and you'll also see kind of cankers like weeping sap and other signs of poor health. It's got a bigger suite of symptoms than these other diseases, which you can see the leaves are very distinctive. But is often the most common one you'll find in your area. Yeah, the curriculum unfortunately doesn't kind of promote this study of local diseases enough, although it is mentioned in a couple of the specs, the idea of using trees for looking at communicable diseases. Another interesting topic for fieldwork is ecological succession. And I think 3 of the A-level specs actually have a whole section on primary, secondary succession, so particularly relevant for those. And an easy investigation to do, which I know John, I think we had a discussion about this on Twitter, were you part of that discussion, is the idea of just digging over an area of ground or putting some topsoil in a tray and then seeing what happens. That's the kind of easiest ecological succession study of secondary succession that you can do. And here's an example of that in this slide. And actually, you can often just see this in the natural environment just kind of happening, particularly in autumn. I've just been seeing this everywhere this autumn, this nice process. And what I think is really interesting is already you're seeing some examples of adaptations of different plants. So you've got this well-developed dandelion plant on the right, which of course has grown from a section of rhizome. So you can demonstrate, the benefits of vegetative reproduction compared to the herb Robert here, that's all germinated from seed. And what's really nice, which is something I'm having really fun exploring with our video production for the MOOC, is succession in built up areas. So here on the top left, you've got lichens and mosses, which will start to colonize tarmac after just a couple of years. This is something I've been observing in a road that was resurfaced near us. And then in places where some leaf litter can accumulate, you start to see those short-lived ruderal annual species like groundsel is just there. And then alongside this railway siding in the bottom left, this is also where I live, we've got perennials actually colonizing from the embankment. So you've got this lovely, well, probably not lovely if you work for the railways, but lovely to a botanist, embankment covered in all sorts of perennials, herbaceous and woody perennials, and they're just throwing their stolons and so on through the fence and establishing in this area of wind-blown leaf litter. So that's kind of interesting. And then over here we have an abandoned netball court. And nice to meet you, Bronwyn. Thanks for coming. And here we have shrubs and even small trees taking hold, and a growing root cell has turgor pressure up to 0.6 megapascals, which is over 3 times that of a car tire. So it's really quite impressive what's going on with osmosis and turgor pressure in these roots. And we've got very much a combination of weathering, physical weathering, and biological weathering going on here, just like in a more natural environment. So really nice for kind of looking at some of the key concepts in succession. And this again is something that we're going to be covering in our forthcoming course. So that's everything I'm going to kind of say about fieldwork for the moment, and then I'm just going to very quickly run through some ideas that aren't linked to curricular learning, but could fit into enrichment activities. So these are activities that we've used a lot at kind of science festivals, environmental education events, for just kind of getting people to stop and get engaged with plants. So one really nice activity is experiencing a plant with all the senses. It can be a bit like a meditation exercise, and a classic for a school activity is doing this blindfolded and then trying to draw or find the plant that you've just been experiencing with your blindfold on. And this is something, this kind of embodied multisensory learning is something we explored in one of our studies. And these were some of the quotations from students. These were Key Stage 2 students. And things like, I learned the different feel of them. Every single plant felt a bit different. So it's very much about diversity and kind of starting to appreciate how different plant species are, rather than just being that kind of green backdrop. There's some really lovely craft activities you can do with plants, such as clay prints, cyanotypes. In the top right, we've got a whistle made of elderwood, and then in the bottom right, we've got nettle string. And I'm always amazed at how adults as well as children are always fascinated with these activities. And this is an approach that I've used a lot with children and adults and in training courses, is combining the learning of plant identification with a foraging activity for edible or useful plants. And our recent review paper suggested it's a really powerful way of developing plant awareness. This is another nice approach I've used a lot, is hedgerow basketry. And there's about 30 common trees, shrubs and climbers you can use for this. And on the right on this slide, you can see a basket that I made almost entirely from bramble. Of course, you strip the thorns off first using gardening gloves, or this could be a very prickly basket. And that's some of the species that you can use. And we'll have videos on how to do these activities in the MOOC. You can also use a number of common plants and twigs from trees for dyeing textiles, like the examples shown here. So we've got this lovely blue color, for example, from foxglove, this pink from oak twigs, and then this lovely bright yellow from buddleia. And it's really valuable if you're doing activities like this to embed opportunities to develop identification skills, for example, making records through drawings and photographs when you harvest the plants, to refer back to at later stages and encourage retrieval. And that's something that, in my opinion, isn't done enough in outdoor learning. So Sarah has an enrichment afternoon every fortnight, lots of learning outdoors. That sounds amazing. Wildlife garden, friendship garden, brilliant. So hopefully that's some new ideas for that. And that's the end of this slideshow. And just to mention again about our MOOC. So this will be a free open access online course, hopefully coming around April time. And it will be about outdoor learning and plants. And that's a list of the videos that are going to be in the course. And that's that image is from our last MOOC. So if you want to get an idea of the kind of format of these kind of courses, then just search on that course, and that's free to sign up to. And we'll share details with you about those nearer the time. So what would be really great to look at in our final 10 minutes would be which resources that we've looked at you'd be most likely to use, and any ideas that I haven't covered. So any other ideas that you'd like to share for engaging people with plants.